Section 4. You will hear a lecture on the history of Melbourne's water supply. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
As we all know, Australia is one of the driest continents in the world. So in the last few sessions, we've been looking at various aspects of the water resource of Australia. And this morning, we're focusing on the history of Melbourne's water supply. The area surrounding the Yarra River and Port Phillip Bay, that is now Melbourne, was originally inhabited by the Wurundjeri people, you may probably know. And these Indigenous Australians had no need for complicated water supply systems. Instead, they relied on local rivers and creeks or dug shallow wells to tap supplies of underground water. The first European settlers who arrived in Melbourne in 1803 also drew water from local creeks. However, as their settlements grew, demand for a reliable water supply system began to grow. In 1803, the first attempt at settlement of the Port Phillip region was on the Mornington Peninsula when Colonel David Collins established a camp at Sullivan's Bay. The only source of water for almost 400 convicts, Marines, and free settlers was 6 wooden barrels sunk in the sand to tap groundwater. Although settlement of the Port Phillip region had gradually grown after Collins arrived, it was not until 1835 that John Batman officially claimed the establishment of Melbourne. 5 years after its official beginning, Melbourne's population had already reached 7,000. Water pumps were installed on the northern bank of the Yarra River. Men with water carts sold water door to door for 3 shillings a barrel, equal to about 30 cents for 550 litres. Due to the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s, Melbourne's population rapidly increased and Melbourne was transformed into a major city. At the same time, many new industries and buildings were being developed. These factors all meant that systems needed to be created to supply water to Melbourne. And in 1857, Yan Yean Reservoir, Melbourne's first water supply reservoir, was completed and began to supply water to Melbourne, which by now had a population of 100,000. In 1891, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works, MMBW, was formed and became responsible for Melbourne's water supply. Melbourne had grown to a city of 500,000 people. To provide water to this rapidly growing city, especially the eastern suburbs, the Watts River, near Halesville, was tapped. It supplied water to Melbourne via the Maroondah Aqueduct. Time takes us to the 20th century. By 1910, there are 123,227 connections to Melbourne's water supply system. And in the 1920s, in response to growing complaints about water quality and lack of water pressure in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, a large-scale dam construction program began. Maroondah Reservoir, about 55 kilometres northeast of Melbourne, was completed in 1927. The completion of Maroondah Reservoir, O'Shanassy Reservoir in 1928 and Sylvan Reservoir in 1932 saw Melbourne's storages boosted from a capacity of 30,000 million litres to 104,500 million litres. A very dry summer in 1937-1938 resulted in water restrictions being imposed in Melbourne. The Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works also started planning for the building of a new dam to expand Melbourne's water supplies in 1940. After the Second World War, the population in Melbourne increased sharply in 1950s, which meant that new water supply requirement occurred. The Upper Yarra Reservoir was completed. tripling Melbourne's total water storage to nearly 300,000 million litres. In the 1960s, many parts of the water supply system in Melbourne were replaced, and following the severe drought of 1967-1968, the building of Cardinia Reservoir commenced. Work also commenced on diverting part of the flow of the Thompson River in Gippsland into the Upper Yarra River catchment. To meet growing demand in the western suburbs, particularly during summer, a reservoir with a capacity of 27,000 million litres was completed at Greenville in 1970. Now, before I move on to the 1980s, I'd like to say something about...
That is the end of section 4.